Okay, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Happy Hanukkah if you're in Israel. Just everyone is in a different place today. It's such a pleasure to be learning together again here as part of Drisha's Full Zman. Today's class is discussions on the Parashah this week with Ms. Shalhevet Schwartz. Just a reminder that I'll be sending everyone an invitation to become a panelist. That if you accept the invitation, that would allow you to participate in class verbally, ask questions, make comments. Just remember to please keep yourself muted when you're not actively speaking so we don't have background noise. And then feel free to unmute whenever you'd like to actively speak. You can also engage in the chat box here on Zoom or as a comment if you're watching us live on Facebook. And hope you choose to turn on your camera so we can see each other. And just a few words about Shalhevet here. Shalhevet is a student at Yeshivat Drisha in Kfar Hetzion. Before arriving to Drisha, she served as a research and program coordinator at Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. She focused there on supporting the work of the Kogod, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, Shalhevet, Kogod Research Center, the Institute's think tank. She received her BA from Yale University, where she graduated in 2021 with a degree in philosophy. She spent several summers working in experiential Jewish education at Camp Stone, most recently in the roles of Rosh Moshava, head counselor, and Rosh Beit Midrash, and last year taught a weekly Talmud Shiur at Columbia University Hillel. She's also a member of the current cohort of Yeshivat Macharat. I need help with that one.
Vatichtov.
Vatichtov. Okay, if it was in Hebrew,
Yeah.
it would have been easier for me. Vatichtov fellows. And with that, I'll turn it to you, Shalhevet.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Evie, and thank you so much to the entire Drisha team. I also just wanted to just say from the get-go that because I spend most of my time in a different place affiliated with Drisha as an institution, the Yeshivat Drisha in Kfar Etzion in Israel. If at any point after this class, any of you are curious to hear anything about the yeshiva and want to get in touch with me, I'm sure Evie or someone can give you my email. But I just wanted to say thank you to Drisha, to Evie, and everyone for this opportunity, and I'm really, really looking forward to learning with all of you. I also just wanted to say I'll be spending the next 56 minutes or so talking about Parashat Vayeishev, and specifically talking about the role of dreams in the Parashah and in Tanakh and in the Jewish tradition more broadly. But it's also Hanukkah here right now. It is, for me, it's 7:34 p.m. So we just lit candles a little while ago, and I think it's always a kind of interesting thing to talk about the Parsha when there's also a Chag going on. And I think I often like to kind of spend a moment to maybe think about how those things might be connected. And I think specifically with the story of Yosef and his brothers, there are a lot of different ways that those stories might be connected in some way to Hanukkah. Those parshiot come out around the same time every year. But specifically, I think when it comes to dreaming, there's something about this time of year. It's a very dark time of year. And Hanukkah in particular, I think, as the year is kind of the days of the year are getting shorter and shorter, and there's more and more darkness, then all of a sudden to kind of fill that with light, I think there's something there's something very dreamlike about that. That like sometimes in our moments when we are kind of least conscious, least awake, when things are sort of dark, we can sometimes those are the moments when we sort of see the most clearly. And I think one of the things that I'll be talking about is what is it that dreams can show us, and what is it that we can learn from dreams, and how can they shed light even when they come to us in moments of darkness. So that was just a thought I was thinking about as it got dark here and as I was lighting candles, and hopefully we can think about that as we go ahead and talk about not anything directly Hanukkah related, but about dreams more broadly and about dreams in these parshiot. I also just wanted to say from the get-go that those of you who are here, whether you're a panelist or not, there are going to be a few moments where I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions, and you should feel free to obviously chime in then, but also if you have questions earlier, you should feel free to chime in even when I'm not necessarily pausing, if there's something that you want to add, or there's something that you I can clarify further. Because of the webinar format, I'm not totally sure how it works in terms of like the raising hand function or just unmuting or whatever. Evie, I'm sure, is the expert on that, but however you can kind of however it makes sense to participate, please feel free to. And I think there are going to be a number of moments where I actually specifically ask for those of you who want to share thoughts or reflections to share those. And I'm excited to learn together with you. I made the source sheet, but in my mind, this is communal learning. So with that, let's get started. This week's Parsha begins and ends with dreams, right? It begins with Joseph dreaming a couple of dreams about of grandiosity over his brothers, right? He's going to he dreams of bowing sheaves and of bowing stars to him, and then at the end of the Parashah, Yosef encounters the servants in Pharaoh's prison, the Sar HaOfim and the Sar HaMashkim, who each have nightmares, and Joseph takes on the role not of the dreamer but of the dream interpreter. And I want to think about those dreams, and specifically to kind of try to understand more deeply Yosef's dreams, and think about them within a larger context of what dreaming is like in Tanakh and in the Torah more broadly, what dreams mean, what assumptions the Torah has about the content of a dream, its prophetic implications, its psychological implications, and to think about what that might mean for us as we, all of us have our own dreams, both literal and metaphorical. So if you're following along with the source sheet, I want to start actually outside of this week's Parsha with two different examples that I would consider two different models of dreams. These are both from the book of Bereshit, but from the book of Genesis. Two different models of dreams in the Torah, and I want us to think. We'll read through each of them. They're each brief. I want us to think together about what these two models, what makes them different, and also as to think about what they have in common. Think about sort of what the fundamental features of a biblical dream are, and also what the important questions we should ask when we see a dream. Right? Is it this kind of dream or is it that kind of dream? So the first dream that we're going to start with is from Bereshit Lamed Aleph. It's from the Parashah a few weeks ago. It was in a moment when Yaakov was fleeing his father-in-law's house. He was fleeing Lavan's house, and Lavan realizes that he's fled and starts chasing after him, and has almost caught up with him. And in the middle of the night, he goes to sleep, and God comes to him in a dream. So this is source 1 on the source sheet if you're following. Right, the pasuk says, "Vayavo Elohim el Lavan ha'arami b'chalom halayla." God appeared to Lavan the Aramean, that's Yaakov's father-in-law, in a dream by night. Vayomer lo, and said to him, "Hishamer lecha pen tedaber im Yaakov mitov ad ra." Watch out, beware of attempting anything with Jacob, good or bad. So that's dream number 1. Very succinct. God comes to Lavan in a dream and says, "Don't mess with Yaakov." That's dream number 1. Dream number 2 is also going to come from the Yosef story, but it's not one of the dreams from this week's Parsha. It's going to be the dream that is the beginning of next week's Parsha, Parashat Miketz, or actually there are 2 dreams there, but and this dream, the person who dreams it is not Yosef, but is Pharaoh. So I'll read that too. Vayhi miketz shnatayim yamim, after 2 years' time. This is source number 2 on the sheet. Ufaro cholem v'hinei omed al hayor. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. V'hinei min hayor olot sheva parot yifot mar'el v'riot basar batir'ena ba'achil. When out of the Nile came up 7 cows, handsome and sturdy, and they grazed on the reed grass. V'hinei sheva parot achirot olot acharehen min hayor ra'ot mar'eh v'dakot basar, v'ta'amodna etzel haparot al sfat hayor. Presently 7 other cows came up from the Nile close behind them, ugly and gaunt, and stood beside the cows on the bank of the Nile. Vatuchalna haparot ra'ot hamar'eh v'dakot habasar et sheva haparot yafot hamar'eh v'habariot. Vayikatz Paro. The ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 handsome, sturdy cows, and Pharaoh awoke. this is a recurring dream. There's another one that instead of cows, there are sheaves of wheat, but we're going to skip that one for now. There's also a dream. Pharaoh falls asleep in the middle of the night and he dreams of cows on the Nile, skinny cows, fat cows. The skinny cows eat the fat cows. Oh no. And then I skipped in the source sheet until significantly later when Paro hires out or finds Yosef, Joseph, the famed dream interpreter, and asks him to interpret his dream. And when he reports his dream to Joseph, Joseph responds by Yomer Yosef al Paro. Or what is Joseph? Joseph said to Paro, Chalom Paro echadhu et asher ha'elohim oseh higid leParo. So Pharaoh's two dreams. We skipped the second one, but his two dreams are actually one dream. And then what does Joseph say? Pharaoh has been told what God is about to do. So these are two different dreams. Both of them from the book of Genesis, and they have some things in common, but they also have, I think, some important differences. So I would love to hear from you, for those of you who can either say things out loud or put things in the chat. If we're thinking not about content, but about form, right? What exactly is the dream doing? Is it a prophecy? Is it something else? How is it working? I want us to start by thinking about what are the important structural differences between these two different models of dreams, right? They look pretty different. It's the word dream, in both cases, the word dream is used, but it seems like something very different is happening in the first and in the second. So I would be curious if any of you want to jump in and let me know what differences pop out at you. Debbie, it looks like you want to jump in.
I think dream is a vehicle for God to communicate. And in one, it's straightforward, keep quiet. There's no interpretation necessary. What you see is what you get. He gives him an instruction. It's terse, and it's, like a headline in a newspaper. This is, keep your mouth shut, basically. But God was more polite. In the second one, it's symbolic, and it needs somebody to mediate. God is sending you a message. You have to figure out what that message is. What are the elements in there? And if you're not capable of doing that, ask somebody else. And both of them, God is giving a message. It's the form that's different in the two of them. And that's why the second one is always longer.
Okay, amazing. You said a lot of things, so I want to try to break it down into a couple different pieces, but I think that you touched on a lot of the really important points. One was, I think one of the main thing that you said, that in terms of the difference between these two dreams, is that one of them is clear and one of them is cryptic, right? One of these dreams is, right, what it is that God is communicating happens and you said that's probably why it's shorter, because there's no metaphor, there's no symbolism, there's no allegory, right? And the other one is cryptic, which means, and one of the ramifications of that is that it's actually the person who dreamed it himself couldn't figure it out. He needed to find someone else, right? He woke up and he was like, what the heck happened? And he knew it was important, but he didn't know what the right interpretation was. So the one is clear and one is cryptic. I think we could even say that one's message is, well, yeah, let's start with clear versus cryptic. I think, well, we might complicate that a little bit later. And you also pointed, I think, at a similarity between these two dreams, which is that both of them are God communicating a message, right? When you and I have dreams, and right, Paro has a recurring dream here, right? I imagine many of the people in this room have also had their share of recurring dreams. And when I wake up from, a recurring dream that I know I've had a million times, I'm not necessarily, my immediate reaction is not necessarily, oh, what is God trying to tell me? Although, maybe it should be a little bit more of that. But one of the things that you're pointing to is that in both of these situations, whether it's clear or whether it's cryptic, it's clear that the content of the dream is, the way that I put it is, the content of the dream is externally generated, right? Something comes to me from the outside, God, in both of these cases, because God has a message for me. I want to think about one other difference that I think you pointed to, Debbie, but I just want to sharpen it a little bit, which is a different difference between these two dreams. What's the point of the dream? Like, what is the point of the message in the Lavan story, right? God is warning Lavan, telling him not to do something, right? He's giving an instruction. Whereas in the second case, right, how does Joseph say it when Joseph explains to Pharaoh what's going on? Joseph says, Pharaoh has been told what God is about to do. Right? God didn't give an instruction in this dream. There, in the story in Miketz, right, Joseph has plenty of instructions, right? Joseph says, okay, if we're gonna have this famine, then here's what you got to do. You got to set it up this way, and you got to and like you should probably hire me too. But all that comes from Joseph. It doesn't come from God. All that God, the content of the dream in the beginning of Miketz is informative, not instructive. Right? Oracular is maybe the way that I would put it. When we think about the oracle at Delphi or other kind of prophetic, in both cases there's revelation involved, but in one of them it's prophecy in the way that I think we typically understand it, and in one of them it's instructions, it's divine instructions, more like giving the Torah or something like that. So I think those are the models that we have, and I think yes.
I'm sorry, but could you say that in the one of them, God is instructing the person directly what to do or what to refrain from? And in the second one, God is saying, this is what I'm going to do. Now you have to figure out how you're going to respond to that.
Exactly. I think that's a perfect way of putting it. But I think one of the things that or when we think about these two models together, I think what emerges is a set of questions that I think are questions that we should be asking ourselves when we encounter any dream in Tanakh. And I think usually we can make certain assumptions, right, about the content. But I think one question that we can ask is, right, is it open or clear, or is it cryptic, right? And right, is the meaning obvious? And I think, as we'll see with Joseph's dreams, it's like not quite as clear. Is it informative or instructive? Right, the same, right, that same question, right? Is this God communicating what God is about to do, or is this God communicating what you, the dreamer, ought to do? And I think there's this further question, which is the question of, okay, how is it externally generated or is it internally generated? And I think we'll see what our instincts are about Joseph's dreams on that question. But throughout the book of Bereshit and throughout Tanakh in general, when people dream, it's usually pretty clearly externally generated. Either it's prophecy, maybe it's because those are the dreams that the Tanakh sees it worthwhile to tell us about. But usually when we see dreams in Tanakh, God is communicating something somehow. So I think we can, when we see a dream, it's worth at least starting with that baseline assumption, even if we want to complicate it or question it. So with those models in mind, I want us to take a look at the text of Joseph's dreams specifically, and I want us to think about all of those questions as they relate to Joseph's dreams, and not only, okay, what kind of dream does this look like, but also we see the characters interacting with the dream as it's happening, right? Joseph dreams it, and then he responds in a certain way. When he tells it to his siblings and his parents, they respond in a certain way. So I want us to think about, what are our answers when we look at this dream to those questions? And also, what are the characters' answers to those questions? What do they think this dream is? So with that,
may I add one thing about Paro's dreams?
Totally.
Okay, it's not, I mean, we know the outcome of the story, meaning that when Joseph interprets them, Paro says, oh, you're so smart, why don't you take care of this problem? But it's not, if you just take the self-contained dream and Joseph's interpretation, Paro could have just said, thank you very much, go back to jail or go do whatever you want. I'll figure out what I'm supposed to do now.
Yeah, so, and I think that the point that you're making there is you're really stressing the fact that the instructions aren't actually part of the interpretation of the dream, right? The instructions are separate. The interpretation of the dream is what God is saying, what God's going to do. You could take it or leave it. You could decide to ignore those things. You can decide that you think this interpretation is wrong. And you certainly don't get from there the content of the dream is descriptive. It's not prescriptive. I think that's what you're pointing to.
Right. I mean, it God doesn't say in the dream anything that would indicate that Paro should, use Yosef specifically to.
Exactly.
Anyway, yes.
That was all Yosef's clever thinking. All right. Let's take source 3 and look at Yosef's dreams, which is the opening of our Parashah Vayeishev. So Vayachalom Yosef Chalom, Vayhaged le'achav, Vayosifu od sno oto. Joseph had a dream, which he told his brothers, and we get some parentheses after this happened, they hated him even more. Vayomer lehem, Shimu na hachalom hazeh asher chalamti. Said to them, hear this dream which I have dreamed. V'hine anachnu me'alamim alumim betoch hasadeh. V'hine kama alumati v'gam nitzava. V'hine tisubena alumotechem, v'tishtachavena la'alumati. They were binding sheaves in the field, when suddenly my sheaf stood up and remained upright, and then your sheaves gathered around and bowed to my sheaf. Vayomeru lo achav hamalochtim lo chalenu imashol timshol banu vayosivu otznoto al chalamotav al davarav. His brothers answered, do you mean to reign over us? Do you mean to rule over us? And they hated him even more for his talk about his dreams. Vayachalom od chalom acher. We got dream number 2. Yosef, Paro, these dreams kind of come in pairs. I think it's worth thinking about the recurring dreams that we have. Not only dreams that we have once, but the dreams that tend to follow you. So Vayachalom od chalom acher. Had another dream. Vayisaper to le'achav. Vayomer hine chalamti chalom od v'hine hashemesh v'hayareach v'achadasar kochavim mishtachavim li. So he dreamed another dream, and he told his brother, saying, look, I had another dream. And this time, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to him. Vayisaper el aviv ve'elachav, vayigar bo aviv, vayomer lo, ma hachalom hazeh asher chalamta? Havo navo ani v'imacha ve'achecha li'ishtachavot lecha arza? So when he told his brother and when he told it to his father and brothers, his father berated him. What, he said to him, what is this dream you have dreamed? Are we to come, I and your mother and brothers, and bow low to you to the ground? So his brothers were brought up at him, and his father kept the matter in mind. So that's what we've got so far. I am curious what your instincts are in answers to all of those questions. So specifically, let's start with internally or externally generated. That's question number 1. Question number 2, meaning does it come from him or come from God? Question number 2, is its interpretation obvious or cryptic? And question number 3, is it informative or instructive? Right? Is it telling him what's going to happen, or is it telling him what ought to happen, or like what set of actions he should take or what kind of future he should set in motion? If someone wants to take a stab at like what their instincts are in relation to those questions, feel free to chime in.
Well, I think it's symbolic because it's longer and descriptive, and it has items in it, objects, as opposed to the Chalom of Lavan, where Hashem speaks to him and says da 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 da.
Amazing. I want to push you on that. Meaning, I definitely agree that it's symbolic. It's not. It is a dream that requires some drash. It's not just pshat. Is it hard to figure out what it means?
I think you first need to answer, you'll excuse me, whether it's internal or external. Is this a hope of Yosef, or is this Hashem telling him, buddy, you're on the money, you're right, with your thoughts?
So you're saying that maybe I'm curious what you think the connection between those two questions is, but I think that one thing that you're pointing to is this one seems a little bit less obvious that this one is externally generated, right? Right. Which is to say, this seems awfully suspicious given the obvious meaning of the symbols, and they kind of seem to correspond with, we know a little bit about Joseph's attitude and the way that he relates to his brothers and what he might, wish or desire would be the case. So, I have Debbie has some suspicions that this is externally generated. Very fair. And I think you're right to point out that it structurally looks a lot more like those kind of cryptic dreams of the and we'll see later also the Paro's servants see dreams and they're like, what's going on? There's a like why are there vultures and why is there whatever and what's happening? Or the cows eating cows. Seems like that because they're symbols. But on the other hand, if I were to ask a 10-year-old who knew a little bit more about the story, what do you think this dream means? The 10-year-old would probably be able to interpret it correctly. If I were to ask the 10-year-old about 7 fat cows eating 7 skinny cows, I'm not sure they would jump immediately to 7 years of plenty. I switched which cows were eating which cows, but 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. So what we've got is questionably externally generated. Seems maybe like I have a strong hunch that it might be internally generated, and maybe somewhere in between on the cryptic to clear question, because on the one hand it's using symbols and metaphors, and on the other hand it seems pretty obvious what those symbols and metaphors mean. Thoughts about informative versus instructive? Anybody else want to chime in? So I think that for the informative instructive question, we might have to actually look a little bit later in the story and see what happens. And we're going to see pretty briefly, we're going to see that that's going to be a question that that medieval and modern commentators have arguments about, specifically with regard to this dream. But I also want to take a second to think about how do the characters seem to be approaching this dream or thinking about this dream, right? Daniel thinks it's very likely that this dream was internally generated from Joseph. But I'm not sure that Joseph thinks so. And I'm not sure that Jacob thinks, or I'm certainly not sure that Joseph thinks so. And I would say that my evidence for that is as follows. Joseph gets up and tells his brothers about it, tells his parents about it. He's like, hey, look, I had this dream. If this dream were really just, explaining something about Joseph's inner psyche, right? What exactly would be the purpose of telling it to his parents? It sounds like Joseph was bragging, right? And if Joseph was bragging, then presumably he thinks that there's something prophetic about this, right? That this, maybe he's, whether it's informative or instructive, maybe he's coming to tell them like, hey guys, look, God sent me this message saying this is going to come true. Or maybe he's saying, you guys better listen up because God wants you guys to be worshiping me, or something like that. And then we see a little bit of we just know that his brothers resent him. I don't think we can tell that much from their reaction, but we see Jacob's reaction also. Jacob, Joseph's father, and he's one thing that I want to kind of point out clearly is that he seems to think that the interpretation of this dream is extremely clear, right? He's not like, hey, I've got a fascinating interpretation for you. I think this means that as you think that your mother and brothers and I will bow down to you. He's like, it's obvious what this is about. This is about, right, you've got 11 stars and me, clearly you think that this is going to happen. But he seems a little bit more suspicious about the internally versus externally generated question, right? He's saying, do you really think is this looking likely to you? We're not going to necessarily explore them inside today, but there are a number of medieval commentators, Parshanim, who stress that, right, Yaakov totally doesn't buy it or believe it, that it'll happen, in part because one of the characters in this dream is Joseph's mother, and Joseph's mother is dead. So, in fact, right, clearly it's not prophecy because it's impossible. And then we'll see how things play out, how things shake out down the line. But so I think what we see already is that this dream in particular is a little bit more open in its texture, just in terms of how, like, what kind of dream this could be, right? It's symbolic, but it's clear. And Joseph seems to think that it's externally generated, but other people in the story seem to think it's internally generated. And I want us to take a moment also just to think about, as the story goes on, the informative versus instructive question, right? The question of whether or not this dream is coming to say, Joseph, you got to make this happen, or whether this dream is coming to say, Joseph, just so you know, you're in luck, this is going to happen. And I think we can see that a little bit later as the Joseph story progresses, again, from a moment actually in next week's Parashah. It's hard to, when you talk about Vayeishev, you have to also talk about Miketz. When you talk about Miketz, you also have to talk about Vayeishev. So we're just doing a Joseph day.
May I add something?
Yeah, totally.
Okay. There is a context for this dream that before he has these dreams, we already know that he's been tattletaling on some of his brothers, and that his father gave him the code, and his brothers were jealous of him and they hated him. So that kind of, to me, leans a little bit to thinking that Joseph was, feeling very haughty, and that this was more about him.
So you're on Team Jacob here, right? You, like Jacob, think that this was maybe an internally generated experience, right? Which, it's good company to have.
Like, it wouldn't be surprising for someone who's been, pampered like that and not loved by the rest of his brothers to feel like, I'm going to get you one day. One day you're going to be bowing down to me.
Right. And one question that I want to pose, and I want people, and I think a lot of answers will occur to everyone right now, but I want people to sort of sit on it for a little bit and kind of think about it as we go forward, is that if that's the case, if it's an internally generated dream, right, the vast majority, if not all, I don't want to necessarily say all, because there might be an exception, but dreams in Tanakh that we hear about are externally generated. And if it's the case that this one really just comes from Joseph, why would the Torah tell us about it? I guess it's plot relevant, so, right, because that's why they hated him and whatever. But so I just want us to kind of think about that, and what are the ways then, if it really is internally generated, that it relates to the rest of the narrative as we go on. So with that, let's kind of think a little bit about the narrative as we go on. Just for purposes of time, we'll stop for questions in probably about 4 or 5 more minutes. So, but I want us to think about the moment, right? Joseph rises to power in Egypt after his, masterful interpretation of Paro's dreams. He becomes in charge of the entire economy. Everything's great. Eventually, his brothers, who are starving in Canaan, have to come down to Egypt to buy food, because that's where the famine is. That's where they're, surviving the famine with plenty and food, and they don't recognize him. And we see a scene as the brothers come. This is the first trip down, which means that they're coming without Benjamin, because Jacob said, Benjamin, my second favorite kid, and Joseph's full brother, we don't want anything to happen to him. So he's still up there. So 10 brothers come down to Egypt, and they bow to Joseph. And what the Torah says, and we're in source 4 right now, at that moment, is Vayizkor Yosef et hachalomot asher chalam lahem. Joseph recalling the dreams that he had dreamed about them, right? Joseph remembered the dreams that he had said. Vayomer alehem meraglimatem lir'od et ervat ha'aretz batem. So Joseph said to them, you are spies, you have come to see the land in its nakedness. One interesting thing that I want to point out, actually, about the way this translation, I think this translation has an opinion in the debate the interpretive debate that we're about to see between the Ramban and Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. So we'll hold that for a second, but we'll see the debate. But Joseph remembers the dream, and he says, you guys are spies. They bow to him. Joseph remembers the dreams, and it says they're spies. So there is a famous debate between medieval and even later Parashanim about what when it says Joseph remembers the dreams, what exactly did he remember? So we've got the Ramban in source number 5 here, and he starts by quoting Rashi. I'm just going to read this in English because it'll go faster, and it's a big chunk of text. So recalling the dreams that he had dreamed about them, quoting Rashi now, that is, he remembered the dreams which he dreamed concerning them, aka the sheaves and the stars and the moons, and now knew that they had been fulfilled, for they had bowed to him. So saw them, they came, they bowed, right? This works very well with the narrative of the text. Saw them, they came, they bowed, and he remembered the dreams. This is the language of Rashi. In my opinion, says the Ramban, the matter is the reverse. Scripture states that when Joseph saw his brothers bowing down to him, he remembered all the dreams which he had dreamed concerning them, and knew that in this instance, not one of the dreams had been fulfilled. He knew that it was inherent in their interpretation that according to the first dream, at first, all his brothers would bow down to him. And now since he did not see Benjamin with them, he conceived of the strategy of devising a charge against them, so that they would also bring his brother Benjamin to him in order to fulfill the first dream, right? Maybe Rashi fits well with the pasuk before it. He saw that they bowed, and then he remembered the dreams. But the Ramban is thinking about the story as it unfolds after, right? Joseph sees that his brothers are bowing to him, but he's like, whoa, this isn't good enough. We're missing Benjamin. We're missing one. I need to fulfill the dream. So I need to get Benjamin down here. So I need to trick them into thinking that I don't trust them. And if I don't trust them, then they have to bring Benjamin so that I trust them. I'm gonna just finish up. It was only after fulfillment of the first dream that he told them, I'm Joseph, your brother, in order to fulfill the second dream, right? Because then once he reveals himself, his dad comes, right? Were it not for this consideration, Joseph would indeed be regarded as having committed a great sin, bringing anguish to his father, leaving him for many days in the position of being bereft and mourning Simeon for Shimon and for him. Even if it was his intention to cause his brothers minor anguish, how did he not have compassion for his elderly father? But he assigned each to its proper time in order to fulfill the dreams, knowing that they would truly be fulfilled. So according to the Ramban, right, his remembering the dream is he sees the dream and as a result of that tries to figure out how he is going to fulfill the dream, right? So according to Rashi and according to the Ramban, what do we have in terms of informative versus instructive, right? So according to Rashi, Rashi doesn't give us that much in terms of his language. The Rav Shimshon Hirsch will kind of give us a little bit more in terms of beefing up this kind of position, but seems to think it's informative, right? Joseph saw that the dreams had been fulfilled. There was a prophecy that this would happen, and hey, look, it happened. I guess awesome. Means that God is doing the stuff that God said God was going to do. On the other hand, the Ramban sees it not as informative, but as instructive, right? The Ramban is seeing the fulfillment of the dreams not as a prophecy from God, but as a command from God, right? And not only, right, it's a command from God so important that it functions as an excuse to behave in ways that are otherwise, that the Ramban says are otherwise a great sin, right? He's causing so much pain and anguish to his brothers and his father, and he's going through this like whole thing. He threatens to kill them, threatens to keep them as slaves. Like Joseph's behavior doesn't make any sense, but unless, according to the Ramban, you see it as an attempt to fulfill what he sees as a divine command, right? As an instructive dream. Right, God says, do this. And Rashi, on the other hand, and let's actually take a look at a position that's sort of similar to that of Rashi, as in source number 6, kind of elucidated a little bit more by Rav Shimshon Hirsch, right? He says, we must attempt to explain Joseph's behavior as it is reported in scripture. We might have assumed that Joseph would reveal himself to his brothers immediately, not only for the sake of his father, right? His behavior doesn't make any sense, particularly since he already recognized the hand of God in all that he had undergone and had learned to see all of his troubles, including his brother's sins against him, as divine tools in service of his ultimate happiness, right? What does seeing the dreams mean for the Rashar Hirsch, for Joseph? It means seeing that they had been fulfilled, like Rashi said, which means noticing the divine hand, noticing God's hand in everything that had happened to him. Maybe Joseph otherwise would have been like super resentful of his brother, super angry. But now, right, he sees this was a prophecy. It had to get fulfilled. It makes sense. Gamzu the tova, everything, right? And Joseph does end up in the end of the story articulating an attitude that's sort of like this, right? He says, Lo atem mechartem oti hein achim Elohim. He says, right, you didn't sell me here, or it wasn't really you that sent me here. It was really God. But it is, and the Rashar Hirsch continues, and this is where he really goes at the Ramban. It also is not plausible that a wise and understanding person, such as Joseph, would believe that he was obligated to conduct himself in service of his dreams. Right? What's he saying? It's not plausible that Joseph would believe he was obligated to conduct himself in service of his dreams. Right? What the Ramban's saying doesn't make any sense. Joseph doesn't need to fulfill his dream. If there is significance to a dream, the Rashar Hirsch says, one can leave its fulfillment to the one who sent it. Right? If God wanted to tell me this was going to happen, God can worry about it, making sure it happens, right? The Rashar Hirsch here is presenting, it's interesting. At the beginning, we talked about sort of two different models of the biblical dream, and maybe this is specifically because the Rav Hirsch is talking about symbolic dreams, maybe, but the Rav Hirsch seems to think there's really only one type of dream. If it's an informative dream, right? Like if God's telling you something's going to happen, God doesn't need you to worry about making it happen. God can take care of that on God's own. It reminds me almost of sort of some Greek tragedy, like the story of Oedipus. There are a number of other ones where like people try, even when you try really hard to escape fate, doesn't work, right? If the oracle tells you it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Just sit back and relax and enjoy the show. so I think this kind of instructive versus informative question, right? There's tension here too. And I think it's not totally clear from the text. You can sort of read it this way or that way. And I think thinking specifically about this debate between the Ramban on the one hand and Rashi and Rav Hirsch on the other, before we kind of move on to part two, to sort of a different direction that I think we can sort of take this story and that can shed light differently. I think pausing here for the to think a little bit more about this debate and about the question of sort of what destiny means to us. I think we could all sort of use to think about that a little bit, right? For the Ramban, or let's start with for Rashi and Rav Hirsch, right? Destiny is it can reassure us a little bit, right? The fact that something is fated, the fact that, and I think a lot of us do kind of approach life this way sometimes when things happen that we didn't necessarily expect, or right, the idea that God is the puppet master who's actually controlling the show, right? It can give us a lot of solace on the one hand. On the other hand, there's something very powerful, I think, about the Ramban's vision, which is no, destiny doesn't work like that. Like destiny makes a demand on you. And even the notion that something is fated to happen, it doesn't get you off the hook, right? In fact, sometimes the Ramban might even take this to an extreme, and that it can even excuse behavior that might otherwise morally or whatever be problematic. We don't necessarily have to take it that far in order to see that there's something empowering about the Ramban's view as well. So before we kind of move on to complicate the picture a little bit more and to kind of enter in from a different angle, I want to see if people have thoughts, questions, reflections thus far about the way that kind of the particular ambiguities around Joseph's dreams in particular play out here in the story. It looks like Rachel Burke is raising her hand, or Rachel, or if you want to.
Oh, an attendee. Let me see. 1 second, Rachel. Okay, Rachel, you should be able to speak right now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm listening to all this, and it's very interesting, and I'm wondering, not only did he, okay, now I'll join as a panelist, you can actually see.
Rachel, go ahead.
Okay. Is it also possible, besides it being fated, destiny, whether it will happen with or without him? What about the idea, and I mean, I guess it plays upon maybe Joseph's own emotions that he would want this fulfilled because he's very powerful in this dream, but why is it not a cautionary tale closer to what we saw with Lavan? I mean, I know Lavan was like straight, no metaphors, etc., but just because you dream something doesn't mean it's good.
So you're saying maybe we should take it in the other direction, right?
Yeah,
maybe the oracular vision is the thing to watch out for, not the thing to want to make happen. That's fascinating.
More of an omen, obviously, I guess that's not what happened in the Torah here, but it's an interesting thing when you say whether it's externally or internally generated. His internal emotions decided how he would take it. Instead of, he could have been super humble and said, "Oh, I gotta avoid that situation."
So I think that you're touching on something that I think is super important, and I think we'll actually I want to ask for your thoughts in another 15 minutes when we get through the next section, because I think that there's something very deep and I think profound in what you're saying, that I think we're going to see a Gemara that moves in a direction that I think looks a little bit more like that, and we'll see how it sort of plays out here. So yes, and
okay.
Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay. So with the remaining time we have, I want to kind of enter in from a different angle, and I think we actually are gonna end up somewhere that is sort of close to what Rachel just offered, and I think we're gonna see what the question of internally versus externally generated might be a little bit more complicated than we might think, and the relationship between a dream's kind of reflection of my own internal desires, wants, etc., and reality as it plays out, right? That relationship might be a little bit right there. That relationship might go in a lot of different directions, and might be a little bit more fruitful than we might have thought otherwise. So I want to start with a Gemara in Masechet Brachot, which is part of a very kind of long, a long meditation on dreams. You see that there's it's a section of Masechet Brachot that's not halachic at all and really just talks about dreams. There's a moment that feels very like almost Freudian, and it's like, if you see this symbol in a dream, it means that you're going to have a male child, and if you see this symbol in a dream, anyway, it's a fun couple of dapim in Masechet Brachot, but we're going to look at a particular moment, and a particular principle that gets learned out from it. The principle is kol hachalomot holchim achar hapeh, which is all dreams literally go after the mouth. So all the way I'll be translating it is all dreams follow the mouth of the interpreter, and we'll see what that means. So the Gemara starts with a story. This is source number 7. Amar of Bizna bar Zabda, Amar Rabbi Akiva. Bizna bar Zabda said that Rabbi Akiva said that Amar Rabbi Panda, Amar of Nachum, Amar of Biri, Mishum Zaken Achad. So it's a long chain of people, Mishum Zaken Achad, in the name of one old man who said, one elder, and Manu Rabbi Bana. This elder is called Rabbi Bana, and he said, I'll read it in English. There were 24 interpreters of dreams in Jerusalem. One time, I dreamed a dream and went to each of them to interpret it. What one interpreted for me, the other did not interpret for me, meaning they all gave me different interpretations. And nevertheless, all of the interpretations were realized in me, but they all came true. To fulfill that which is stated, all dreams follow the mouth of the interpreter, right? This story is coming to tell us a principle. The principle is dreams follow the mouth of the interpreter. And the story is that I got 24 different reads of this dream, and all of them came true. So what's the principle there? Think about it for a second. And I think the sort of the shot of what the principle is there is that the true meaning of the dream and the interpretation that the dream happened to get, right? We think, okay, the dream means something, and someone tries to interpret it, and either they get it right or they get it wrong. And the right answer is the thing that's going to happen if there's a dream that's going to happen, and the wrong answer won't happen. So if you get it wrong, then like, sad for you. But what the principle of dreams follow the mouth of the interpreter is coming to tell us is that no, actually, the section here, I called it constitutive interpretation, meaning that I think the interpretation itself is constitutive of the meaning of the dream, right? There's something very almost that feels a little bit postmodern about it, right? That the way that you interpret it actually determines what the truth is, right? The meaning of the dream is determined by the way that people read it. Now,
so what you're saying is, excuse me, that there's no objective truth about it.
that's not what I'm saying. That's what the Zaken Achad, whose name is Rabbi Bana, is saying. But I believe that is what this Gemara is saying. And I think it's a pretty radical statement. Now the Gemara goes and learns this from actually from the story at the end of our Parashah of the dreams of the baker and the butler. So right, is it to say that all dreams follow the mouth of the interpreter? Is that from a verse, right? Can we learn that from the Torah somewhere? Yes, and in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar, as Rabbi Elazar said, from where is it determined that all dreams follow the mouth of the interpreter? As it says, it came to pass as he interpreted to us, so it was, right? Ka'asher patar lanu kein haya. What happened? But this is when the butler is telling the story of like he's telling Pharaoh about how great Joseph was. He's like, yeah, and the thing he said came true. His interpretation came true. The butler doesn't say he was right. He says his interpretation was. And there's a kind of the Gemara here is reading that to mean that the interpretation itself made it so. Right now, Rava has a caveat. Rava said this is only in a case where it is interpreted to him in a matter akin to the dream, meaning you can't just make up an interpretation of a dream. It has to be like plausible. It has to make sense in light of the dream, right? I couldn't say the 7 cows represent 62 years because that doesn't make any sense. It has to, it has to match. But given that, right, any plausible interpretation of a dream makes it true, right? That's what I think what this Gemara is saying. And we actually see, we'll do this very quickly, but because just for purposes of time, but we see that that question actually shows up in among the interpreters of like among Parshanim on the towards the end of the Parashah, on Parashah Vayeishev, about how seriously are we supposed to take this Gemara, because it's again pretty radical, so radical in fact that Ibn Ezra, a very famous medieval interpreter, is like, don't pay attention to it. If you look very quickly, right, source number 8 is the story of the Pharaoh's servant's dreams, and Ibn Ezra, his commentary there, right, on Joseph says to the butler, tell me your dream, right? He says, Halo la Elohim Pitronim, right? The part that's in bold there. Surely God can interpret it, and literally it's do not interpret, like, don't interpretations belong to God? So when Ibn Ezra, the response to that, he's like, what Joseph's saying there, he's saying a totally normal thing. He's saying, God is the one who sent you this dream. This is an externally generated dream. There is a correct interpretation. I hope I'll get it right, but I'm going to do my best, but I might get it. But Joseph's not saying I will necessarily get it right. He's saying the interpretations belong to God. The interpretations don't belong to me. I'm not making the truth of this dream. It's God's dream. I'm just doing my best to interpret. And if you look at the very end of the Ibn Ezra there, right, since this, the rabbinic statement that all dreams follow the interpretation, this is the last line of source number 9. The rabbinic statement that all dreams follow the interpretation, that's the opinion of an individual sage. Don't worry too much about it, but you can see Ibn Ezra contending with this. He knows this Gemara, and he knows how radical it is, and he doesn't think it's pshat in the story. And he doesn't want us to be getting any ideas that like interpretation of the dream itself is constitutive of its meaning, right? On the other hand, the Or HaChaim, who's a later classical, more mystical, more Kabbalistic interpreter, so he really takes this Gemara as explaining to you what is going on in that story of the baker and the butler. So what does he say, right? Joseph's sentence, remember, Halo la Elohim Pitronim, right? Do not interpretations belong to God? So the Or HaChaim pays attention to the fact that Joseph uses the word Pitronim, right? He uses the plural, right? Interpretations, which, you could definitely say maybe it has to do with the fact that there were 2 people who had dreams, so there were several interpretations. But the Or HaChaim's like, no. There's a deeper meaning to that. What does he say? When Joseph, this is source number 10, when Joseph referred to interpretations, he did so in the plural. As told, there were 24, and now he's quoting the Gemara, 24 regular dream interpreters in Jerusalem. Right? This is what Joseph had in mind when he said God has interpretations. Joseph meant that a dream is capable of many different interpretations, all of which are correct. Right? That no matter, right, sure, the interpretations the dream is from God, right? These interpretations, there's something divine about them, but they're right in virtue of them being interpretations. And there can be many of them, and they can all be right. Right? There's something about the practice of interpreting itself that grants meaning to the dream. So, right, we see this tension showing up, right, even already among the interpreters. But I want to ask, and then I think as we kind of generate a couple of ideas about like how this works or why it would work, it might shed a little bit of light also on what's going on with Joseph and his own dreams, and the relationship between the dreams and the way that they play out in reality. But let's say that the Gemara is right? Like, what is the Gemara really saying? What does it mean? What would it mean for the interpretation of the dream itself to constitute the meaning of the dream, right? Why would it be that 24 different interpretations of a dream would all come true? If you have ideas, feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to add your thoughts. Anyone?
Maybe God sends a message, but how we react to it and what parts of it we choose to embrace, like Rachel was saying before, how we look at it affects how our lives will unfurl. In other words, there are many roads, many ways that a dream can be interpreted, and you put yourself, what you bring to it in this world influences what was in that dream. You know, if it frightens you, you respond one way. If you can see the positive in it, you respond another way. If you say it's a lesson for me to be learned, that might be yet another way to look at.
Right. No, I think you're spot on. And I think, right, the interpretation being constitutive of its meaning, I think, is maybe one way of saying the thing that you, Debbie, are saying right now, which is that actually what I take from a dream my dreams affect me, right? They don't just show me something, they affect me. And I think this actually gets in a very interesting way at
but how they affect you, but how they affect
you is you, maybe, right? This is, you're already also getting at there's an interesting relationship already here between the internal and the external, right? Is it what's generating what, right? Maybe it's coming externally, but it changes you because you see it this way, and then now you behave in a certain way that you wouldn't have behaved if you had interpreted the dream differently. But if you had interpreted the dream differently, you might have done something else. Maybe you're doing it in order to enact the dream. Maybe you're doing it because you don't want to enact the dream, or maybe, and that's all assuming that it's starting from the outside. I also think you could even take it in the opposite. You could sort of reverse it. Right? How do we experience dream? Meaning, I think about dreaming. There's a way that, right, in a kind of modern scientific way of thinking about dreams, right, we think of them as not necessarily like visions that we get from the outside. We think of them as they're generated from, whether you're a Freudian, and we'll read a moment of Freud at the end of this source sheet, but whether it's whether you think it's your repressed unconscious, or whether you think, I don't know, some combination of your sense impressions that your neurons are doing something with, right? They're generated internally in some way, but we don't experience them as such, right? There's a difference between the experience of dreaming and the experience of thinking while you're awake, right? When you're awake, you have some amount of control over what your thoughts are. You can direct your thoughts in certain places or not. Right? Something that's fascinating, I think, about dreaming is it shows you something about yourself with the experience of it coming in from the outside, right? It's like you're watching a movie, but like the thing that you see in the movie is the stuff you didn't know about yourself, whether it's your wants or desires or your fears or your anxieties. And that there can be something even about the internally generated that actually has external implications for the world, right? Because, right, knowing yourself in a different kind of way, understanding those desires or fears or anxieties can shape the way that you interact with the world around you. And part of the reason why that's able to happen even is because you experience it as though, right, it's because you experience it as though externally generated, right? There's something kind of forced upon you to look at or to stare in the face that you maybe wouldn't have been able to think about in that way, right, on your own in a waking state, let's say. So I think, yeah, Rachel.
Just the words that keep coming to mind as you're talking about internally and externally, and whether, you know, the interpretations have, I like that interpretation. It's very empowering. I just keep thinking, lo b'shamayim hi, lo b'shamayim hi. Like, it's not just up there. I
think you're totally right. I mean, I remember when I first looked at this Gemara, right, the source number 7, right, about dreams, I was like, my first reaction was thinking about, like, what if we took all this stuff with dreams and thought about it in about halakha instead, right? That there's something about interpretation actually constituting the meaning of, right, in this case, it can be a dream. It could also be a text, right? And that in a lot of ways, that actually is how the halakhic process works. And I think, right, you're pointing to Lo B'Shamayim, which is a story about how, right, God actually wants us to behave that way towards halakha, right? That interpretation constitutes truth. So yeah, I think that connection is like a really important connection, and it was one that was, I think, very exciting to me when I looked at this Gemara. And I think when we think about what it means in both cases, I think prophecy and Torah, like, we're trying to fulfill God's will in the world, and there are ways that can kind of only happen when we take seriously our own contribution to the meaning of God's will in the world.
Just one other thought I had, and I don't know, I don't think it's an original thought, or maybe we're going there anyway, is that just because Yosef references God does not mean that Yosef views it differently than the Gemara. I think it it was very much strategic and in Yosef's interest to say, this is God, not me, doing this, because one of those dreams was about to kill off one of the dreamers. And he didn't want to be the interpreter who caused the death. It was God's plan.
Right. Yeah. Oh, you're talking specifically about the two servants of Paro.
If you
I
go,
thought you were
right.
talking about Paro's dreams, but either way, right?
Doesn't he interpret? But he only
thinking
mentions
about-
God later when he's in jail again.
He mentions God a couple times. He mentions God in jail. The first time he mentions God again when he's with Paro. But even with Paro, I think there's a way that he also has a lot of self-interest in mind, and he's also being like, no, it's not me, it's God, it's God, it's God. Although with Paro, whether it ggets fulfilled that way does seem, I guess in both cases, it seems like there are definitely external factors that are going on that sort of prove him right, but who knows? And I think so. The last two texts on the source sheet are different. One of them, I'll start with 12 because it's the last paragraph of Freud's interpretation of dreams. And I think, right, he I think gets at in a very kind of succinct way, I think the core of a lot of what we've been saying, which is he spends a bit of the introduction of the book saying like all the silly classical thinkers who think that dreams are oracles, like they're unscientific, but dreams can't tell you anything about the future. And then he goes on to like have his whole, Freudian, so quasi-scientific account of what's going on in dreams. And then at the very, very end of the book, what he says is, "And what of the value of dreams in regard to our knowledge of the future?" So can they tell us anything about the future? That, of course, quite out of the question. One would like to substitute the words in regard to our knowledge of the past, right? What's he saying? They're not externally generated. They're not prophecy. They're internally generated. For in every sense, a dream has its origin in the past. In the past. And now the sentence, I think, should start with like a very big but, and I think this but is like a really important but. The text wasn't originally in English, so I can pretend it was there even if it wasn't really there. But the ancient belief that dreams reveal the future is not indeed entirely devoid of the truth, right? The idea that dreams are kind of prophetic or revelatory, right? There's some truth to that. What's the truth to that? By representing a wish as fulfilled, right? That's his whole theory is dream as wish fulfillment, right? The things that you didn't necessarily know that you wanted, your kind of deeper desires. Your dreams are presenting them as fulfilled. The dream certainly leads us into the future, but this future, which the dreamer accepts as his present, has been shaped in the likeness of the past by the indestructible wish, right? That the ways in which the dreams can inform us about the future is because they're shaping the future through kind of showing us our wishes. And I think just the kind of note to leave you with is this is also a line from the Gemara and Brachot from that same kind of general area. But if during Birkat Kohanim, if you see this is printed also in Sidurim, there's a moment when between the Birkat Kohanim and when they say Amen, that there's this paragraph that you're sort of supposed to maybe mumble to yourself, maybe just look over to yourself about, and it's very interesting. It doesn't seem to match, but it's about dreams. And right, it's a prayer, right? And it says, right, God, I am yours and my dreams are yours. And I think, right, then it goes on to say, I've like strengthened the good dreams and get rid of the bad dreams. And if I've always found this paragraph to be like very beautiful and very moving, but I think there's something kind of about that kind of first line, Ani shalach v'chalamotai shalach, right? What does that mean? Does that mean that those dreams are generated externally? I'm not sure. But I think I think the way that I would think about it maybe is that that our dreams are gods in the same way that we are gods, right? Meaning they come from God, but like in no different way than like our own agency and our own selves come from God, which is to say that thinking in a kind of dichotomous terms about sort of prophecy versus psychology, right, sort of loses the point, right? That really when we think about God's hand in our own lives, and we need to also think about ourselves and who we are and what we want, and that maybe prayer can also be a kind of a way to do that, right? Prayer can also be a way to think about, right, on the one hand, we're sort of asking for external intervention from God, but on the other hand, we're shaping ourselves through prayer. And there's something about kind of the same way the dreams, the experience of an external experience, even when there are moments when it might be generated internally, can actually affect us and affect the world in really deep ways. I think prayer might also there might be some similar processes going on as we pray. So yeah, this is there's some food for thought about dreams, and I think that there's a lot to think about specifically, just in terms of, right, what does it mean what does it mean to kind of be shown who we are, to be shown who we are, and to be shown what the world will look like, and how does that shape us, and how does that shape the world? And yeah, what are our dreams, and what would it mean for them to come true? Happy Hanukkah. And thank you again for all of you, for those of you who participated, questions. Thank you, Evie, again, for all the support on all this.
Thank you so much, Shalhevet, and thank you everyone who joined us today and participated in this class. Thanks so much for being part of our learning community always. Winter's Month returns to Drasha this year. It's December 25th until the 27th on the topic of organ donation in Judaism. You can learn more about the speakers and sign up at 5784.drisha.org/winter. And again, thank you so much, Shalhevet, and thanks everyone else. And I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Lehitraot. Happy Hanukkah.
Thank you so much.
Happy Hanukkah.
Happy